There was a certain yeshiva school that had a sports program. I didn't tell the joke yet.
Yes, you did.
They competed in basketball and in track. And then the administration decided they wanted to expand the sports program. And since the school was situated right next to a very beautiful scenic river, they thought that rowing would be an excellent choice. So they got one of the alumni to fund the program, and they invested in top-of-the-line boats and oars, and they started competing with all the other schools in the 8-man rowing events. But somehow, they just couldn't win even one race. In fact, they always came in dead last. So the administration called in the athletic director and they said, "You got to do better." So they decided to call in an expert rowing consultant. Come observe the team practice, figure out how they could improve. So after watching the team for a while, the consultant sat down with the administration to give his report. He said, "I have studied the situation, and here's the problem. You see, the way this sport's supposed to work, 8 men do the rowing and just one gets to shout the instructions." Please, only one coxswain per boat. We all know that if everyone wants to give directions and be in charge, you can't get anything done. But a little bit of arguing is not necessarily a bad thing. A little bit of discussion, even if it's heated, can take you on the right path. But how often is it that we really don't want to have any discussion? We don't really want to hear what the other person has to say. In fact, we often denigrate others for their views, and we write them off because they hold the wrong opinion. This happens, we know, quite often, especially in the political sphere. And with the presidential election coming up very soon, you know very well what I mean. So I'm going to tell you what happened just a month ago. On Tuesday evening, September 10th, you know what took place? The one debate between the two presidential candidates. And then the very next evening, I had a phone conversation with a member of this community. Don't raise your hand if you're here. I had a phone conversation, and it's someone whom I greatly respect and admire. And the subject naturally went to the debate and the two candidates. Now, I want to tell you, this individual has very strong feelings and opinions about who should be elected. Now, when it comes to politics, you know it's wise and appropriate for clergy to stay clear, or at least to tread very, very carefully. Because you may want to hear what my views on subjects are of Torah, liturgy, Yiddishkeit perhaps. Maybe I have a little knowledge, a little experience. But you shouldn't have to listen to my political views, especially here on the Bima. So let me tell you what I do sometimes. For the sake of having a meaningful discussion, I will steel-man the case for the opposing position. I don't know if you're familiar with the term steel-manning. It's the opposite of straw-manning. The young people know. Straw-manning is when you intentionally make a very weak case for the other side so what you can then knock it down. Steel-manning is when you make the strongest possible case for the other side, and then see whether you can refute it. The aim is to bring clarity and to bring real understanding. So for almost 2 hours, we talked that night. And the discussion was passionate and meaningful. And I did a little steel manning. The very, very next day was a Thursday, around noon, and I met with another individual from this community, someone who I very much respect and admire. And of course, politics and the debate came up. And this individual was just as intensely passionate about supporting the other candidate. I listened and I said to myself, I've had enough steel manning for 1 week. And I just listened, and we had a nice, pleasant, relaxed conversation as I zipped my coffee. Now, you can take away from this something very important. Folks who are intelligent, knowledgeable, and really good people may have very different views, even opposite views. And we have to respect that and not let it divide us. You can challenge the other person's views, and you can debate if you like, but it must always be from a place of respect and humility. I have said many, many times before that truth, MS, is almost always to be found in shades of gray and not simply black and white. But to debate is wonderful. It's one of the most Jewish of pursuits. Every page of Talmud is filled with argument. We know that. The schools of Hillel and Shammai, who disagreed about everything, were revered because they maintained cordiality and collegiality. We say that theirs was a machlokes l'shem shamayim, a disagreement for the sake of heaven. Now, if you recall on Rosh Hashanah, I spoke about the situation on college campuses, and I don't want to say anything more except one thing. Among the many errors made by college administrators, and they made many, not enforcing rules, double standards for speech, arguably among the biggest mistakes was the missed opportunity to create spaces and insist that students come together to talk, to discuss, to debate, to hear the other side, rather than shout and harass. Too many times I would hear interviews, not even an interview, they'd come up to an individual in the encampment and they'd say, you want to hear what I have to say? And they always refuse to even talk. They refuse to have a dialogue. And they always would fall back on the tired and inexcusable excuse that they don't want to, quote, normalize dialogue with the other side. There's a radical notion that a 18 or 19 or 20-year-old ought to come to a university to learn, to inquire, to seek truth, instead of becoming an activist in an area that you know so little about. So I hope that going forward, college administrators and their teachers and students will learn the Jewish value of debate, honest debate, and machlokes, l'shem shamayim. But on this Yom Kippur day, I want to leave the subject of debate. I want to get away from argumentation. I want to get away from noise. And I want to talk a little bit about quiet. Because a year into this war and all that we have had to deal with individually and as a community, I'm interested in the question of how do we find some inner peace and strength and resolve. I know that we, And I know you, perhaps others, are all stressed out. I hear it all the time, how stressed out people are. Everyone's constantly watching the news on Israel. They're following domestic politics, and we're all just burnt out. And we all need just a little bit of silence. I have an esteemed colleague on the West Coast, and I heard that he began his Rosh Hashanah sermon this year by saying, "My dear friends, instead of my immediately going into my sermon, let's just sit here quiet in silence for the next 15 minutes. He knew he couldn't get away with that. So he just began his sermon. But it was a good idea. It was an interesting idea. Because sometimes there's nothing more to say. Words are just superfluous. Silence. There are many examples in Jewish tradition that show us the value of silence. Just a few moments ago, we read from the Torah, from the book of Leviticus, and we read about the aftermath of the tragedy where the sons of Aaron had died. And the Torah very famously says that after Aaron learned, what does it say? Vayidom Aharon. Aaron was silent. There was nothing that could be said. And we know if you ever have to go to a house of Shiva, we're instructed by a tradition not to speak, but just to sit there in silence, because it is our presence and not our words that matter, that offer consolation. Pirkei Avot, that beautiful book, tells us that the great sage Rabbi Shimon says, all my days I have grown up among the rabbis. Lo matzati lakuf tov el hashtika. I have not found anything better for a person than just to be silent. And what is the central prayer in our liturgy that we recite today? The Amidah, which is the silent prayer. This past Monday, I attended the October 7th Community Memorial event that took place in Short Hills. I think some of you were there as well. At that gathering, we heard a recounting of the horrific day by David Boltiansky, a survivor of Kfar Aza. We heard the searing words of Sigal Cohen, a mother of one of the hostages, Elia Cohen. There were moving songs by the Israeli artist Noam Buskila. But I want to tell you that for me, perhaps the most powerful part of the entire program was just sitting there before it all began, just sitting there without any words yet spoken, but being in the presence of nearly 3,000 people. It was the power of that silence, silence in the presence of so many others of our Jewish community and non-Jews as well. Sitting there in silence that gave hope and encouragement for strength and renewal. Silence brings wisdom, humility, and understanding. Silence is not merely the absence of noise, it's an active engagement that gives us a certain space to reflect, to be aware, and ultimately to connect to our Creator. But friends, I have an important question for you. What comes after the silence? What comes after the silence? So I'm going to take you back many, many years to 1956, just 8 years after the founding of the State of Israel. It was the evening of April 11th, and 3 Fedayeen terrorists entered Safrir, which was a Chabad village, At the time, it was inhabited mainly by refugees from the Soviet Union. 3 terrorists. One of them waited by the escape vehicle. Another one cut the electricity to the village synagogue to plunge it into darkness. And the third one entered the synagogue and then fired into the crowd of 46 little children, ages 9 to 16. 5 children died, and their 24-year-old teacher was killed as well. And then other children, of course, were injured. One teacher, Yeshayahu Gopin, he started throwing children out the window in order to save their lives from the shooting. This was an horrific attack. And you can only imagine in its aftermath there was utter despair and dejection. These beautiful Jews who had left and escaped the oppression of the Soviet Union, they finally made it to Eretz Yisrael to live as proud and faithful Jews, and now they were attacked there so brutally, losing their children to terror. They were so terribly traumatized, they began talking about abandoning the settlement. But first, they knew they had to consult their Rebbe, their teacher, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson of Brooklyn, New York. And so they immediately sent him a lengthy telegram informing him of every detail that took place in this tragedy. And they expected an answer that very night. They expected that in these kinds of circumstances, their Rebbe would immediately offer guidance, immediately offer consolation. But for 4 very long days, there was no response. Inexplicably, the Rebbe was silent. Everybody asked, why is the Rebbe not responding? Finally, the telegram arrived, and the news spread throughout the village. A telegram from the Rebbe has arrived, and everybody, all the men, women, and children, they gathered in the village square to hear what he had to say. The Rebbe's response was succinct. In fact, the telegram contained just one single sentence. It was one sentence with a mere 3 Hebrew words. The Hebrew words, Behemshech habinyan tenachamu. Behemshech habinyan tenachamu. By continuing to build, you will be comforted. The Rebbe understood it was not words of consolation that they needed at that moment. It was not explanations of the meaning of why it all took place. They didn't need theological insights. They needed the encouragement to realize that it was all in their hands. It was for them to get beyond the grief. It was for them to act, to continue to build, to continue to grow, to create. That would bring them consolation. And that they did. At the end of the Shaloshim, the 30-day period of mourning, thousands of people from across Israel came to attend the cornerstone laying ceremony for a new vocational school. And it took just 1 year and the new building, the new school was completed. A mere 3 words following the silence saved that village from disintegration, saved the inhabitants from despair. Behemshech habinyan tenachamu. By continuing to build, you will be comforted. We too can learn from that. We too must rebuild the kibbutzim and the villages that were devastated on October 7. We too have to rebuild and nourish relationships with our friends and our supporters. We have to rebuild that faith that in spite of all that has taken place, we will go forward. We'll continue to send our kids to the good colleges and provide them the tools to stand strong and resolute in the face of hatred. We'll build and support our institutions of Jewish life, like our synagogues, our federations, our hillels. And yes, we will declare that we will dance again on Simchat Torah. And we're going to continue to sing Hatikvah. We know Hatikvah, the anthem of Israel, means hope. Did you know that a phrase in that song was borrowed from the prophet Ezekiel? Ezekiel's most famous prophecy is about the dry bones in the valley. And the dry bones declared, if you go back to the source, you read it, the dry bones declare, Avda tikvatenu, they say, our hope is lost. And then God instructs the prophet to give hope. Now, when we sing Hatikvah, the words by Naftali Hertz Imber, who wrote them in 1878, he took those words of Ezekiel and he turned them around just a little bit. Instead of Avda tikvatenu, what do we sing? Od lo avda tikvatenu. We sing Od lo avda tikvatenu. Our hope is not lost. No, it's not lost on this Yom Kippur, nor will we ever lose that hope. Behemshech habinyan tenachamu. We will continue to build and rebuild because Am Yisrael chai v'kayam. We, the people of Israel, lives and will endure forever. Kemar chatima tova. May we all be blessed and sealed in the book of life. And let us say, Amen.